Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw, coming to you from the CHEK News World Headquarters in Victoria. The Premier takes on big social media companies and also pivots on decriminalization. Those are some of our topics this week and another busy week in BC politics. To break it all down, we will bring in the pod squad. Jeff, Jillian, and Ali are here. Apologies to you all for cutting into the panel last week with the Prime Minister's visit to CHEK News. He wanted to come back on again this week. And I said, no, Mr. Prime Minister, we got to get back to the panel. With all due respect, sir, request denied. So we got the full time this week. So don't worry about it. We're going to go on. Full 22 awesome minutes. Starting with something that's happening right now as we tape this. You'll probably be listening later. But Premier David Eby backing down on decriminalization after months of controversy about how it has contributed to public drug use in hospitals and parks and beaches, places like that. We don't know the exact details quite as we are recording this, but we know that he is asking Ottawa for additional exemptions to ban public drug use in those areas, allowing police to arrest folks and seize their drugs. The inevitable pivot that we have been talking about after the NDP getting hit on this issue quite a bit in the last few months. So let's just kind of go around and talk about that. I don't think any of us are super surprised, but what do we think about what's happening here, Jillian?
Well, I think, it'll be interesting to hear the government explain how this is different from just ending the pilot program altogether. Decriminalization, the goal is to sort of prevent stigma, to really focus on this as a health issue rather than a criminal issue. And if you're giving the police the ability to arrest again, how are you reducing the harm that criminalization causes? I think, the government is obviously feeling a lot of political pressure on it. They want to show that they're being responsive to that with an election looming in the fall, and that's where this is coming from. But the reality is, I think, a lot of this public drug use that we're seeing is more rooted in growing homelessness and increased poverty than it is in decriminalization. And that's why you're seeing it in jurisdictions, all across North America, not just BC, where we have this pilot ongoing. And until we have, more safe consumption sites, until we make a real dent in homelessness, until we have more treatment options and mental health supports, I think we're going to continue to see some of this, public drug use, and the opposition is still going to have, anecdotes to point to continue to hammer the government as we do approach the election in the fall.
Yeah, I don't imagine it will stop the opposition from continuing to paint decriminalization as, this incredible social disorder, even though it will exist in name, but functionally sort of not exist it's kind of hollowed out in all the public places. Jeff, does that serve the NDP, the argument that it's still in place, even though functionally maybe not?
Well, it's in place. Wouldn't agree with your suggestion that it's backing down. I think I think when you said pivot, I think that's more of what this is. Government continues to try to do two important things that British Columbians care about an awful lot. One is save the lives of people who are experiencing addiction and who are being poisoned and killed by the addition of things like fentanyl to street drugs by drug traffickers and predators who profit off of their trauma and their misery. So you continue to see the focus on treatment. You continue to see the focus on keeping people alive so that they can get into treatment. You continue to see the investments in social programs and housing and healthcare and supports, mental health supports, to help people make that first step into recovery when they're able. But there's also the very real issue of street disorder and open drug use on our streets, and the public is concerned about that. And if you don't address that, as we anticipate the province will here by going to Ottawa and saying no open drug use in beaches, no open drug use in parks, doorways of small businesses, in hospitals where nurses are trying to work, where healthcare workers are trying to to work and help people at their most vulnerable. You have to do both. And I think the government is trying to do both, and it's a very fine line. They're walking on the edge of a razor. We'll see if this lands. But they're trying to do both. They're trying to save lives, and they're trying to protect people. And we'll see if they do it.
Does that dilute the art of the pivot here? Because when we talk about, in the past, we've talked about how, governments typically need to sort of admit they made a mistake in order to pivot and acknowledge a concern and then take action on it. And if we don't know for sure, but if the idea here is to continue to say Decrim is in place and working, but we're just kind of tweaking it over here, does that allow them to execute the kind of pivot they need to get out from underneath this, do you think?
I think the only way that they're really going to be able to execute the pivot while also saving face is also to point blame at other levels of government here as well, or other organizations. But what I think is actually an important part of this conversation is how the opposition pivots in how they've been attacking the government on the rollout. Because we want to be compassionate here. At the end of the day, this was set to save lives and to be something to help people. Well, if the opposition then claims it as this overwhelming victory of like, hey, look, we won and we did this and we pushed so hard that as opposition, and now the government has backed down on this, well, it's going to come across as a little insensitive, don't you think? And so I'm more interested to see what the response is going to be from the BC United and the Conservatives, while also being compassionate to the fact that we still have to fix this issue somehow. And so it's not really an overall win for the province, rather going back to the drawing board, figuring out how we do this with the right resources, and going into a election this year. It's all about how we communicate it to the voters, not necessarily the actual rollout.
Mm-hmm. And nobody is winning when thousands of people are dying a year from an overdose crisis, and we're altering policies that may or may not be working. You're right. It's a very good point, and we will see how the opposition reacts, get some more details on it. I'm sure we'll be talking about it next week on the show. I want to move on to another thing that happened this week. Premier David Eby pausing the government's bill to sue social media companies like Snapchat and Meta and the tickety talk for the kids out there for public health harms like addiction, saying he's going to try and negotiate improvements to online safety for children with these companies through a roundtable. Instead, coming amid a backlash from the business community that said the legislation was too broad and could have let government sue anybody for almost anything. So I have some thoughts on this, but Ali, we're going to stick with you. Go first on this. Is it the right move to pause and negotiate, or do we have any hope that might do anything, or how do you view this playing out?
Eby's government is very sneaky. I've said this over and over again. They are masterful communicators. So what they've done here is essentially highlighted them having this seemingly win with the social media giants. But really what they've excluded from this conversation altogether was the fact that their government would have been immune from any sort of litigation, or if anyone tried to sue them. That was in the bill. No one talked about that. And then the other was that those big industry associations opposing this because of these unintended consequences. And isn't that like the slogan of this NDP government, is the unintended consequences? No one really thought about how that would affect businesses. And that's why we saw the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade speak out to it, large industry associations. So I think it was the right move to pause it, but it was also the right move to pause it because they knew that they were going to get in trouble a few years from now when it all potentially rolled out and didn't work out in their favor.
Mm-hmm. No kind of admission that it was to deal with the business community concerns. In fact, the Premier sort of discounted that, but you have to think that played into it in some way. Gillian, how do you view this?
Yeah, I agree. I think that this was obviously, them backtracking because of blowback from the business community. When you look at the language that was used in the initial announcement against the Meta and other social media companies, is very, very strong language. They call them faceless corporations and wrongdoers, really sort of positioning the government to appear as this sort of champion protecting the public interest from them. And now they're going to sit at the table in a sort of like kumbaya moment to sort of, come together and focus on their shared values. I don't I think that it's obvious that they didn't, want to move forward with so much criticism from the business community, because the legislation really would have applied to any public health harm or mental health harm caused by any industry in BC, which could apply to so many different things. And that shielding that Ali was talking about for government industries is because, of course, the government is in charge of liquor distribution. And there's so many other things that the government is involved in gambling that, arguably causes a lot of harm that, we could be culpable for as well. So I think, it was rushed, the initial announcement, and it's a shame, because I think that it is important for the government to have the ability to hold people accountable, companies accountable if there are, significant harms. And now it's going to be really hard for them to ever pass a piece of legislation like this again that might be more, targeted and narrow in scope, that would actually sort of, accomplish what they initially set out to do.
And not just liquor and gambling for government, but also safe supply and some of the other more contentious areas that you're right. That it's an interesting point, Ali, that you and Gillian, that you both made on that. Jeff, what do you think?
I love the business blowback if I'm government in this, because it's exactly what empowers me to be able to go to the social media companies and say, you got to sit down. And it's not just because I'm government and saying that to them. It's because all of those business groups who are raising issues and concerned aren't just talking to government, they're talking to the social media companies and saying, your bad behavior is putting us in this spot, so you better fix it. And I think that's what ended up happening here. You had the government who used this bill as leverage to get companies that are really powerful and have a history of not working with governments on anything. Check out Elon Musk and Don Lemon interviews on your YouTube shorts or whatever you get those video things on these days. And they don't want to do that work. And in BC, they're going to give it a go. And you can say, well, BC will never get them to come to heel. But little things like this, other states and provinces are watching. They see the crack in the door. They see the light coming in. And I can tell you that all those states in the United States that are threatening to sue the class action lawsuits with the social media companies are looking what BC's done here and saying, we're going to do that too.
Is there any kind of outcome here that would allow for a political kind of win on the verge of an election? Let's say like the companies throw a bunch of money into an education safety pot or agree to a non-binding code of conduct or agreement or that type of thing. What is the value in the government if they get something that looks good but maybe doesn't really kind of actually change anything, Gillian?
I think not much. I think, there's, unless it was something really significant, I think, when I first saw this, I thought it was more likely that it's going to be a win for the social media companies, that they can use the government as cover, especially a government that enjoys quite a bit of public confidence here in BC, as a positive sort of PR move for their own purposes. So, I remain skeptical. We'll see if they do come out with something productive. Obviously, like Jeff said, that's a huge win, but I have a hard time imagining that we're going to be able to get something done in a timeline like that.
Ali, do you think some type of kind of, agreement or code or something like that doesn't really, I don't think any of us expect the companies to change the algorithms that are the core of their multi-trillion-dollar businesses that the BC government has criticized for pushing content that harms body image and harms addictions and mental health. I don't think anyone's expecting them to change that, but if they do something else on the prevention side, is that a win for the BC government?
Well, it certainly would be, but I think we've already kind of seen the hand that has already been dealt with the win, and that's the win on news, information, and updates real time on wildfires, right? That's what the government went in asking for, was that there was a massive problem last summer because local community newspapers and publications weren't necessarily able to tell their community what to do and where resources were. And so they've said that they would work with the government and social media companies to maybe fix that. And I think that's it. I think that's the most we're going to get. And even that is a big change to what we can and cannot see given the news bill federally. So I think that's as good as it's going to get.
Mm-hmm. Although as it stands currently, and I think the government wants to get there, but as it stands currently, Meta's only agreed to amplify government press releases, not the local news coverage of a wildfire. But I think you're right. I think that might be the takeaway that BC could get if they push through this table. Jeff, what is there a win in outside of a core fundamental kind of real change to the companies here?
Well, the fundamental real change is what BC is pushing for, and what if they don't see it in the work that's being done will result in Bill 12 coming back and the restoration or the establishment in law of the government's ability to sue the pants off of social media companies for doing harm to young people. And maybe David Eby, and the sight of him and the NDP doesn't strike fear into the small black hearts of social media CEOs, but Carson Cleland should, the 12-year-old kid from Prince George who got trapped by online predators who found him through social media, tricked him to sharing intimate pictures, then sextorted and blackmailed him so badly that Carson took his own life, and his family's been heroic in telling his story and saying, please make it so that our son's experience isn't in vain. And so I think that should have them rightly worried and focused on doing something tangible. It's easy to brush aside politicians, but don't brush aside Carson.
Mm-hmm. I'm just not sure what we would do, because no one has figured out across the world how to handle sextortion or the intimate image sharing or the push of harmful content to kids. Like, no one has the solution in it. But it's good for BC to start the dialogue. Let's move on, and just in our last few minutes here, try to get into another issue involving the Haida Nation was at the BC legislature celebrating the introduction of the bill on its title. We have talked about this issue in the past, a bill that would give Haida title to Haida Gwaii, the first legislation of its kind. It would intersect with private property rights, trying to preserve them. Everyone seemed happy to have Haida there, including BC Conservative leader John Rustad, who stood up and said, I support this, and then the next day went out on social media and called it an attack on personal property rights. Are there political calculations here on this? Do they work in favor of parties kind of flip-flopping around like this? Jeff, we'll stick with you on that start.
Well, what Rustad is doing here isn't about the legislation or about the court case and doing what's best for BC or the nation. If it was, he would be celebrating an agreement between the province and Haida Gwaii that resolves uncertainty around First Nations title over land and protects private property rights in those territories. He'd be doing that, but he's not. He's positioning First Nations as enemies. He's whipping up fear and uncertainty to try and win himself some votes. I'm in Nanaimo right now. I'm at the fantastic Indigenous Resource Opportunities Conference, bringing together First Nations from across BC and companies that are doing good work and advancing economic reconciliation. And I asked some of the leaders, like, what do you make of these comments? And they know Rustad from when he was the minister responsible for these issues in the BC Liberal government. And they say it's sad. It's just sad because he knows better. He knows exactly what he's doing. It's patently obvious that he's playing for votes. And it's disappointing for them. And they say, especially at a time when if you actually got behind First Nations looking to do resource work in communities and speed that up and make it happen faster, there's actually a really good conservative, potential story to tell here. But instead, we're seeing the rantings of a feckless weakling, of someone who won't bat an eye at doing something wrong because it will deliver some political and personal benefit to him. It's the opposite of having the courage of conviction. And I say keep people like that away from the Premier's office because they have no business being there.
It does put, BC United in this position of they have some concerns about the legislation that are more nuanced, the private property rights, how explicitly they are protected. They're trying to take this more like we have concerns, maybe the bill should be paused and as an exposure bill, and they're stuck making that point. Well, the Conservatives are just, throwing haymakers about this that go viral on social media, Ali. It kind of it seems like the right criticism in a kind of pragmatic way, but politically it kind of moves them out of the conversation in this.
You know, what we've seen is that the BC Conservatives, they post things on their party letterhead, like they're already campaigning, and they do the quick videos that they know that they're going to get a ton of people to see, but a quick video is not able to really break down everything that's so comprehensively in this conversation. Now, on the other side, we have Michael Lee, who's the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, and he is doing the unsexy work of behind the scenes, what it really is to be an MLA and someone in government, talking to people, doing the consultation, really breaking this down. And he's a lawyer, right? Michael Lee is. And so we're seeing this like what they would be like in government, but no one actually sees it. He's not putting that on a 30-second video. And so in October, you have two options here. Do you want the one that is 30 seconds and trying to just say anything to get most people to see it? Or do you want someone who's like thoughtfully and doing politics responsibly? So that's the big contrast that I thought was very interesting this week, and what I think we're going to continue to see, one's campaigning and one's governing.
Jillian, what do you make of all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the premier is right when he calls that kind of like the American style culture wars coming to BC politics. And that certainly seems to be what the Conservatives are sort of trying to pick up and bring into our conversation, unfortunately. You know, it's going to be interesting to see as, you know, more people tune in during the election, if people notice that and they, you know, the Conservatives start to say more and more outlandish things that are, you know, more easily disprovable. Or that people understand are to be untrue, if that kind of starts to hit them more, because yeah, it's concerning and kind of untested in BC politics. You know, I think on this issue, it really does the issue a lot of disservice, because we have, you know, agreement from all three parties that we need to advance truth and reconciliation, and this, I think, you know, causes a lot of fear, and, you know, is just spreading misinformation that, you know, isn't helpful to the conversation. So it's unfortunate, and it's good to see the other parties calling it out.
Thank you for watching. We'll be back next week with all the latest here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.